Perhaps you felt this before, waking up on an ordinary day and realizing that, although everything seems the same, something invisible is distorting the air around you. Conversations sound mechanical, goals feel empty, and routine repeats itself like an echo without origin. In that silent moment arises the suspicion that reality isn't what it seems, that there is a hidden code sustaining every detail of your existence. The quantum field isn't a distant concept of physics, but the very fabric that translates what you feel into form, what you believe into circumstance. And when the mind grows quiet enough to perceive this interconnection, the entire world begins to respond differently, as if the universe were finally speaking your language. There's a kind of anguish that doesn't scream. It settles in slowly, like a fog covering the outlines of things. You keep functioning, keeping schedules, answering messages, executing plans, but something inside you watches everything from afar, not really believing in what you're doing. It's as if life had lost its texture, as if the world were a projection without depth, a film that keeps playing even after the audience has left the room. This feeling, almost impossible to describe, is the first sign that the mind has begun to sense that something is wrong with the way you understand reality. The discomfort is born from the fracture between what you live and what you feel you could live. It's the noise between the surface and the interior. You look at the facts and find no coherence. People lie. Efforts don't pay off. Time seems to slip through invisible cracks. It feels as though there's a hidden mechanism moving everything, but it doesn't respond to any effort of logic. That's the point where consciousness starts to fragment between what the body does and what the being feels. And it's precisely there that the quantum field begins to act, silently, showing that apparent chaos is merely the energetic translation of internal incoherence. But before understanding this, despair comes. You try to fix the external. You change jobs, cities, relationships, routines. And for a while, the change seems to work. There's brief euphoria, a feeling of starting over. Yet soon everything repeats itself with a different face. The same arguments, the same emptiness, the same doubts. And the persistent thought, why doesn't anything really change? This is the point where many believe they have failed. But in truth, it's the opposite. It's the moment when reality begins to return to the observer, the exact reflection of the frequency they emit. The quantum field doesn't judge, punish, or reward. It responds. It's a neutral matrix of possibilities that organizes itself according to the dominant vibration of the observer. When you're out of alignment with yourself, when your emotions, thoughts, and actions don't speak the same language, the field responds with fragmentation. The world loses meaning because your emission has lost coherence. It's like trying to listen to music on a badly tuned station. The noise doesn't come from the melody, but from the receiver's misaligned frequency. This realization is unsettling because it returns responsibility, and with it, power. While you believe chaos comes from outside, you feel powerless. But when you realize that chaos is a projection of the inner field, something begins to change. The anguish stops being a punishment and becomes an invitation. The discomfort is the symptom of consciousness, trying to remind you that reality isn't fixed, but moldable. There is, however, an almost automatic resistance to accept this. The rational mind, trained all its life to see the world as separate and solid, reacts with fear. It wants proof, formulas, guarantees. But the quantum field doesn't operate under the logic of control, but the logic of resonance. It doesn't deliver what you ask for. It reflects what you are. That's why the mental effort to try to understand the world almost always increases the confusion. You try to solve the mystery of reality with the same mental structure that created it. In this impasse, something deeper begins to emerge. The silent question that underlies all human search. What is real? When you ask yourself that question truthfully, not intellectually, but as a living wound, the field responds, not with words, but with synchronicities, subtle shifts, encounters that seem accidental, but are not. Reality begins to reorganize around your attention. It's the first glimpse that the meaning you thought was missing wasn't outside, but in how you observed. This realization doesn't bring immediate relief. On the contrary, at first, it can intensify the anguish. Because realizing that reality responds to consciousness is the same as realizing there's no longer an out there to blame. Everything is a mirror. Everything is a return. Each disconnection, each loss, each painful repetition is an attempt by the field to show where your energy still vibrates incoherently. Life isn't against you, it's merely returning to you, amplified, the dissonant note that still needs tuning. Over time, this understanding begins to generate a new quality of silence, a space between stimulus and reaction, between the event and its interpretation. And in that space, suffering begins to dissolve, because what was once seen as chaos begins to be perceived as a process of energetic realignment. Anguish becomes the portal to lucidity. The sense of absurdity turns into a clue. The loss of meaning reveals itself as the deepest invitation to relearn how to create reality, not from fear, but from the consciousness that observes. There are phases in life when effort becomes almost a religion. You believe that if you work harder, think better, plan precisely, and persist long enough, everything will finally align. But for some reason, the universe seems to laugh at that attempt. Things don't move, answers don't come, time slips away, and results don't manifest. It's like rowing against an invisible current. The harder you push, the farther from your destination you seem to get. At this point, common sense calls it bad luck, crisis, misfortune. But through the lens of the quantum field, this phenomenon is the clearest sign of a vibrational mismatch between intention and internal state. The impulse to control is born from the fear of not existing. When you believe that only what you dominate is real, the world becomes a battlefield. Everything must conform to your expectations, and the failure of one of them feels like a threat. Yet the quantum field doesn't respond to the force of control, but to the coherence of vibration. It doesn't bend to the insistence of will, but to the harmony between thought, emotion, and energy. That's why when you try to force reality to work, the field only returns resistance. Not because it's hostile, but because there's no resonance between what you feel and what you want. This mismatch is subtle. You may be visualizing abundance while emitting scarcity, affirming love while vibrating fear. The conscious mind says one thing, but the energetic body transmits another, and the field responds to the latter, not the former. It's in this misalignment that the feeling of powerlessness arises, as if life has disconnected from your will. In truth, it's your will that has drifted away from the field's flow. Trying to command the universe through reasoning is like trying to change a mirror's reflection by adjusting the image, not the one who casts it. There comes a moment when the person, tired of struggling, simply lets go. Not as a philosophical choice, but out of exhaustion. And that's precisely when something shifts. The field responds differently, not out of pity, but because when the mind stops trying to control, vibration returns to its natural state of coherence. This relaxation isn't weakness, it's reconnection. In the silence that follows effort, consciousness begins to realize that reality was never disorganized. Perception was simply saturated with noise. When you realign yourself, the same scenario that once seemed blocked begins to open. There's no rational explanation, only sudden flow. The right people appear, time adjusts, ideas connect, and curiously, nothing essential has changed in the external world. What changed was the internal vibrational pattern that projects it. The experience of everything slipping out of control is, in truth, the field returning to the observer, the signal that they're trying to command something that can only be tuned. Control is a movement of contraction. It stems from the fear that reality won't support you, and it's that contraction that blocks the quantum flow, because the field only responds to expansion. When you try to control, you restrict possibilities. When you trust, you open the spectrum of frequencies through which the universe can operate. Trust isn't passivity, it's alignment. It doesn't ignore facts, but moves with them. The paradox is that the more you try to guarantee the result, the farther you move from the vibration that would make it possible. Notice how the body reacts in moments of extreme control. The chest tightens, breath shortens, gaze locks. The entire nervous system enters a defensive state. Sustained over long periods, this state becomes a vibrational pattern, and the quantum field, true to its principle, mirrors defense in every direction, in relationships, opportunities, synchronicities. That's why sometimes a simple deep breath can have more impact than months of planning. Breath dissolves contraction, and where there is space, the field moves again. It's important to understand that losing control is merely the dissolution of an illusion. Control never existed outside the mind. What we call mastery is only the temporary ability to predict effects within a narrow range of probabilities. But the quantum field operates on infinitely broader amplitudes. It doesn't respond to the linear logic of effort, but to the vibrational geometry of consciousness. Thus, when everything seems out of control, it's the universe reorganizing variables that the human mind can't yet calculate. There's beauty in this apparent chaos, because it's within it that true learning inscribes itself, realizing there's nothing to control, only something to understand. Reality doesn't need to be forced, it needs to be heard. Quantum listening is the art of observing without reacting, of feeling without labeling, of allowing the field to reveal the coherence hidden in what seems like disorder. When that listening occurs, despair turns into curiosity and fear into observation. At some point along the path, you realize that control was never synonymous with power. True power lies in alignment. The world doesn't need to obey your will to be favorable. It only needs to reflect the vibration of your clarity. And that clarity is born when effort gives way to presence. In that state, reality isn't something to be conquered, but something that manifests, not as a response to what you do, but as a mirror of what you are. There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when you realize that the struggle was never against the world, but against the mind itself. Until then, you believed the walls were outside, in circumstances, in people, in the limits imposed by time or by chance. But when consciousness begins to expand, something disconcerting happens. You notice that the prison was always internal, built brick by brick, with thoughts that seemed harmless, but repeated for years, became structures as dense as iron. The human mind, when not accompanied by consciousness, is an engineer of labyrinths. It builds narratives, establishes boundaries, defines the possible and the impossible. The problem is that it believes in its own creations. In trying to protect you from the unknown, it draws a map that seems safe, but in reality, limits the entire territory of experience. Thus, each thought of fear, each misinterpreted memory, each frustrated expectation becomes one more invisible wall. And the most intriguing thing is that the mind calls this captivity reality. Deep down, the mind is not an enemy. It simply can't bear the void. It needs a plot to exist. When something escapes control, it creates explanations. When silence approaches, it fills it with noise. When the quantum field opens into possibilities, it chooses one and clings to it as if it were the only possible truth. The prison, therefore, is fixation. It is the inability to allow the new to manifest. The field is fluid, but the mind seeks solidity. The field is open, but the mind wants certainties. And in this difference of nature, suffering is born. You can notice this in small things: the fear of making mistakes, the need for approval, the impulse to explain everything, the habit of revisiting the past as if it could still be corrected. These mechanisms are the bars of the mental cell. They keep the being imprisoned to the timeline, preventing it from experiencing the now as it truly is, a vibration in constant mutation. The quantum field does not operate in past and future. It responds to the present state, but the mind is rarely here. It lives in what has already been or in what has not yet happened. And so, the body inhabits the instant, while the mind projects absence. When this realization finally reveals itself, the impact is twofold. On one hand, there is relief. You understand that you are not a victim of external forces, but of internal habits. On the other, there is astonishment. Realizing that it was the observer himself who built the prison is a profound shock. It is like discovering that the jailer and the prisoner are the same person. The first reaction is resistance. The mind tries to deny the obvious. It says it can't be that simple, that the world is more complex, that the fault lies with destiny, genetics, circumstances. But the field doesn't respond to justifications, it responds to vibration. And as long as the vibration remains conditioned by fear, the scenario will continue to reflect prison. The mind creates reality not because it has absolute power, but because it is the instrument through which consciousness projects its frequencies. It is the translator between the invisible and the visible. When the translator is distorted, the translation is also distorted. That is why masters of all eras insisted so much on observing the mind. It is not about fighting it, but about seeing it in action, seeing how it moves, how it manufactures stories, how it turns assumptions into facts. This observation, when it deepens, begins to weaken the dominance of automatic thought, and little by little, the internal cell opens. Freedom does not arise from an act of force, but of lucidity. The simple act of noticing the mechanism is already the beginning of dissolution. When you see the mind fabricating fears, it loses power. When you realize that thought is not the same as truth, the cycle breaks. The energy previously trapped in maintaining the walls begins to be released, and the field responds immediately. Small coincidences arise, stagnant situations move, the feeling of density dissolves. The universe reacts to the consciousness that awakens to its own inner creator. The curious thing is that nothing changes outside. The same people remain around you, the same challenges, the same tasks. What changes is the place you look from, and that vantage point redefines everything. The mind, which was once mistress, becomes servant. Thought ceases to be authority and becomes a tool. Reality ceases to be a prison and becomes a mirror. Vibration, once repressed by doubt, expands naturally, and the field, always sensitive to coherence, reorganizes the stage to reflect this new frequency. The true discovery is not that the mind creates the prison, but that it also guards the key. The key is the space between one thought and another, that silent interval where consciousness can choose not to believe what the mind says. This small space is the crack through which the light of lucidity enters. And when the light enters, the walls lose substance. Because what keeps the prison standing is not fear itself, but the habit of believing in it. When the belief unravels, fear dissolves, and the world once again becomes an open field of possibilities. At that moment, you understand that it is not the mind that needs to be destroyed, but the blind identification with it. The mind is part of the field, an instrument for translating consciousness in time. When you observe it clearly, it becomes an ally. And what once seemed like a cell becomes a laboratory, where each thought can be seen as a wave to be modulated. The prisoner discovers that they always had the power to open the door. They just needed to remember that it was never locked. There is an exhaustion that doesn't come from the body, but from the soul. It is the weariness of reliving the same plot in different settings. You change cities, professions, relationships, but deep down the characters change faces without the story changing its tone. The same fear returns, disguised as prudence. The same disappointment resurfaces, dressed up as coincidence. It's as if life were an invisible circle in which you walk believing you are moving forward, when in fact you are merely traveling the same path with different scenery. This cycle of repetition is one of the most intriguing phenomena of the quantum field of consciousness. It is neither punishment nor chance. It is vibrational reverberation. The field responds to the dominant frequency, and as long as the vibration doesn't change, the plot repeats. Life insists on the same lessons, until the energy that sustains them is finally understood. But to the observer immersed in the experience, everything feels like punishment. They feel the emotional weight as if it were a sentence, without realizing it is the echo of an internal note that has yet to be tuned. The most curious thing is that repetition is rarely perceived at first. It disguises itself in details. You attract different people, but with the same kind of emotional absence. You enter new projects that end with the same kind of frustration. You make promises that next time it will be different, but when the next time arrives, the script unfolds with almost mathematical precision. At this point, suffering gains density, because the mind interprets repetition as failure when, in fact, it is feedback. The quantum field merely returns to the observer the reflection of the energy they have not yet transformed. This realization is painful because it shatters the illusion that wanting alone is enough to change. Isolated will is weak compared to the vibrational pattern that sustains it. Repressed emotion is stronger than declared intention. You may claim you have forgiven, but if the body still contracts when you remember, the field understands that forgiveness hasn't happened. The field reads vibration, not speech. That's why life often doesn't respond to what you say, but to what you truly feel. There comes a moment when the weight of repetition becomes unbearable. The pain ceases to be merely emotional and begins to manifest physically. Insomnia, constant fatigue, the sense of being stuck in a time that does not pass. It's as if every attempt to move forward were pulled back by something invisible. That something is unresolved energy, the pattern still active in vibrational memory. The field doesn't distinguish past and present. It reacts to what is vibrating now. And if the body still carries the imprint of old pain, reality organizes itself to mirror it until the imprint dissolves. The way out is not in resisting, but in observing. Repetition is a symbolic language of the field. It shows where energy is still trapped. When a pattern returns, it brings information. It points to a place of incoherence between what you desire and what you believe you deserve, between what you declare and what you vibrate. And it is at this point that consciousness has the opportunity to intervene, not by force, but by clarity. When the pattern is seen with lucidity, it begins to lose density. What was pain becomes energetic data, and data can be reframed. But seeing with lucidity requires courage, because when you look repetition in the eye, you don't just find facts. You find older versions of yourself, still trapped in unfinished emotions. Each pattern is a memory frozen in time, asking for integration. It's not about rejecting these versions, but about including them in the present, recognizing the purpose they were trying to fulfill. The pattern is not an enemy, it is a request for reconciliation. When consciousness embraces what it previously judged, vibration reorganizes. The field perceives the new signal, and reality begins, little by little, to change form. What once seemed like bad luck reveals itself as energetic coherence. What once seemed like punishment reveals itself as a mirror. And what once seemed like meaningless repetition shows itself to be a healing process. Because life never tires of offering the same lesson. It insists until you learn to vibrate differently. When that happens, the pattern naturally dissolves. There is no effort, no magic, no ritual, only the realignment between consciousness and energy. The emotion once repressed moves, and the flow returns. This moment is subtle but transformative. Suddenly, the same kind of situation that would once have thrown you into despair no longer provokes a reaction. The emotion loses strength, and with it, disappears the plot that sustained it. The field reads the new state, and, for the first time, no longer needs to repeat the old cycle. A strange silence arises, as if something inside you had stopped fighting. It is the silence of vibrational release, the instant when energy updates and reality, consequently, does as well. Then you understand that you were never truly bound to the facts, but to the emotions that accompanied them. The pattern was only the way life found to show where energy was still asking for attention. When that attention becomes consciousness, the learning is complete. The pain loses its purpose, and the field opens to new possibilities. Repetition ceases, not because the world changed, but because the frequency changed. And, in the quantum universe, changing the frequency is the same as changing worlds. Pain, in its essence, is a messenger. It is not an enemy, not punishment, not a mistake. It is a vibrational reflection, an energetic mirror that returns to consciousness the state it is emitting. In the quantum field, everything that is felt manifests as vibration. Nothing is lost. Each thought, each emotion, each memory loaded with effective charge is converted into frequency. And that frequency creates interference patterns that shape physical experience. Pain is, therefore, the most direct language the field uses to reveal where there is misalignment between what you are and what you are believing yourself to be. When something wounds you deeply, the first impulse is to project the cause outward. The person who hurt you, the circumstance that didn't work out, the loss you didn't expect. The mind seeks culprits because it needs to locate pain in something concrete. But from a quantum perspective, the cause is not in the events, but in the vibration that preceded them. Reality merely reflects the energetic content you still carry. What hurts you outside is what still pulses within. The quantum field works like a sensitive mirror that returns everything projected onto it. If the observer vibrates rejection, the field organizes to show rejection. If it vibrates fear, it manifests circumstances that confirm that fear. And the same occurs with love, clarity, and coherence. Pain arises when the reflection does not match what the ego wants to see. The ego wants control and predictability. The field returns what is true. The dissonance between desire and vibration is what we call suffering. Understanding this does not make pain more pleasant, but it makes it intelligible. You begin to realize that it does not come to punish you, but to inform you. Each painful sensation is a point of tension asking for realignment. When an old emotion is not processed, it remains frozen in the energetic field, creating distortions. These distortions attract compatible experiences, not out of cruelty, but out of vibrational coherence. The universe does not distinguish right from wrong. It seeks balance. Pain is the mechanism that signals where there are still unintegrated fragments of energy. The body is the first to translate these distortions. It contracts, gets sick, loses vitality. The inexplicable fatigue, the weight in the chest, the persistent anxiety are signs that energy has stagnated. Each symptom is a language. When you listen to the body attentively, you realize it is the most accurate map of your vibration. The quantum field and the body are a single mesh of information. What gets blocked in one manifests in the other. Physical pain is often the last warning of an energetic pain ignored for too long. At this point, many try to eliminate the symptom, as if pain were an intruder. But eliminating the symptom is like breaking the mirror because you don't like the reflection. The field does not change by destroying the reflection, but by transforming the source. This requires presence. You must be willing to feel without judging, to observe pain without labeling it as punishment or weakness. When emotion is welcomed instead of fought, it moves. And as it moves, it releases energy. This release alters the vibration and, consequently, the way the field responds. Pain stops being an obstacle and becomes a portal. Each time you allow yourself to cross a pain consciously, something reorganizes at subtle levels. Suffering is no longer seen as failure, but as a process of vibrational purification. What was resistance becomes clarity. And gradually, you begin to realize that the most painful moments of life were precisely those that opened the way to deeper levels of consciousness. It is at this point that the relationship with the universe changes completely. Instead of feeling persecuted by events, you begin to see intelligence in everything. Each loss, each missed connection, each forced pause gains new meaning. The field is not against you. It is adjusting the frequency of your experience to the coherence of your internal state. When you change on the inside, the field changes on the outside. And when you understand this viscerally, pain ceases to be a threat and becomes a guide. Healing, in the quantum sense, is not the elimination of pain, but the integration of the message it brings. When you welcome the repressed emotion, vibration returns to its natural flow. And the field, sensitive to every nuance, responds immediately. Situations begin to reorganize. What once seemed stuck opens. Synchronicity returns. The universe, which once seemed indifferent, resumes dancing to the same cadence as your consciousness. Perhaps you realize now that pain was never outside the plan of harmony. It has always been part of the realignment process. Each tear, each loss, each discomfort were merely dissonant notes asking for tuning. The field does not seek to eliminate sounds, but to create music. And the melody is only complete when each emotion finds its place in the spectrum of consciousness. If this understanding touched something in you, if this view that pain is merely an energetic reflection asking to be heard made sense in any way, Leave the phrase, "I choose to listen to my pain with consciousness," in the comments. This creates a point of resonance between those who read and those who feel, a vibrational network of presence. And if this message brought clarity, like this content, so more people can transform suffering into light. The field always responds to shared vibration. There is a moment on the inner journey when the veil falls. It is not a spectacular event, nor a dramatic revelation. It is something quiet, almost ordinary. An ordinary look at something ordinary, and suddenly, perception changes. The reality that seemed rigid begins to unravel in subtle layers, and consciousness realizes, with astonishment and tenderness, that it has always been at the center of everything. Nothing you lived was by chance. No encounter, no loss, no delay. Everything was an expression of your own vibrational state, precisely drawn by the field that faithfully responds to the energy of the one who observes it. In that instant, the notion of separation begins to dissolve. The world stops being something that happens to you and becomes something that happens through you. Each event, each person, each emotion becomes a reflection of the field of information that you yourself are emitting. The universe ceases to be a backdrop and reveals itself as a mirror. This realization is at once liberating and unsettling because it destroys the comfort of victimhood and inaugurates the sweet weight of responsibility. Consciousness awakens not only to the power to create, but to the impossibility of not creating. Even when it is unconscious, it continues to emanate frequencies that shape experience. The quantum field knows no absence of emission. Thinking is vibrating, feeling is emitting, existing is projecting. Life is the continuous result of this emission, a hologram that reconfigures itself according to the dominant frequencies of the mind and the heart. And realizing this is like seeing your own energetic signature imprinted on everything around you. This recognition, at first, brings vertigo. You look at reality and understand that you were the one who painted it, including the parts that hurt the most. The tendency is to reject this idea. The ego tries to argue, "I would never create something so difficult." But creation is not done by the ego, but by vibration. As long as there are fragments of fear, guilt, or scarcity active in the energy, the field will reflect them in the form of compatible experiences. Consciousness creates, even without wanting to, and when it realizes this, the game changes. It is at this point that understanding becomes real power. Because if everything that exists outside is a reflection of what vibrates inside, then changing the world is not a matter of force, but of frequency. Attempts to fix reality from the outside, in, become useless. You realize that each act of resistance reinforces the pattern you intend to undo. That is when you learn to act in another way. Instead of fighting the circumstance, you change the internal state that originated it. And the field, obedient to the new vibration, reorganizes everything around you. This is the instant when consciousness awakens to the creative nature of observation. The simple act of perceiving clearly alters what is perceived. It is the same principle as in quantum physics. The observer interferes with the phenomenon. But, on a subjective level, this gains an intimate dimension. When you look at an emotion without rejecting it, it changes. When you see a person with understanding, they transform in your presence. When you contemplate life with gratitude, it responds in sync. The entire universe is sensitive to the quality of the attention that inhabits it. Seeing yourself as a creator is not an act of vanity, it is an act of humility. Because the true creator does not control, he participates. He understands that he is not separate from the field, but is the field itself in conscious form. Everything that exists, from galaxies to small daily decisions, pulses within the same vibrational matrix. There is no my field and the field. There is only the flow. And within this flow, each thought is a wave that propagates, interfering with all the others. What you think about the world literally becomes the world you experience. This realization brings a new kind of silence, a lucid silence, where the need to blame or justify dissolves. Consciousness begins to choose what it emits with more delicacy. A natural attention to one's own vibration arises, not out of fear of making mistakes, but out of respect for the power it possesses. The world ceases to be a battleground, and becomes a workshop for creation. Life, once heavy, begins to move lightly, and pain, which once seemed like punishment, comes to be recognized as a field of energy asking for recalibration. Amid this new way of existing, everything that was previously divided, the spiritual and the material, the internal and the external, the visible and the invisible, integrates. Consciousness understands that creation does not happen in isolated moments of meditation or intention, but in each breath, in each glance, in each minimal choice. Creating is not an extraordinary act, it is the natural way of being. When you realize that you have always been creating everything, something changes forever. Fear loses its meaning, because there is no longer an outside that is threatening, only reflections of your own state of being. Control becomes unnecessary, because harmony comes from alignment, not from force, and time, once seen as an obstacle, reveals itself as a collaborator. Each instant is an opportunity to adjust the vibration and manifest a more coherent reality. This is the turning point of consciousness, the discovery that you have always been the cause and never merely the effect. The quantum field is not around you, it is in you, and you are in it. Each thought is a seed planted in the soil of the infinite, and each emotion is the water that makes that seed sprout. When this truth becomes alive, the entire world changes texture. Reality ceases to be something that happens and becomes something that responds. The human mind was taught to believe that freedom lies in changing what surrounds you, changing environment, routine, people, paths. Everything seems to revolve around the idea that, by altering the circumstance, life will finally align with what you want to feel. But there is a moment on the journey when you discover something that dismantles this logic. Nothing really changes outside, while the internal vibration remains the same. Liberation then ceases to be a horizontal movement of escape and becomes a vertical movement of depth. That is when you understand that the external world does not need to change for the experience to change. It is enough for your frequency to rise. Changing vibration is not denying what exists, nor pretending optimism. It is altering the vantage point, the inner tone with which you read reality. It is when, amid a challenging scenario, you stop reacting and begin to respond. The quantum field reacts instantly to a change in vibration because it is composed of information. Each emotion, each thought, each gesture contains a code that informs the universe how to behave toward you. When the vibration transforms, the code changes, and the universe reorganizes circumstances accordingly. It is at this point that the difference between reacting and creating is discovered. Reacting is operating from the past, from memories, from fear and defense. Creating is acting from presence, from silence, from vibrational coherence. The quantum field does not need effort, it needs correspondence. And this correspondence is only possible when the internal state is harmonized. Changing vibration is, in essence, an act of reconciliation. It is the moment when you stop fighting what is and begin to dialogue with the flow of reality. When you begin to observe life through this lens, you realize that events no longer have the power to define your state. The traffic, the delay, the harsh word, the loss, the noise, everything continues to exist, but no longer drags you into chaos. A stillness begins to set in, an axis that remains even when the world oscillates. This stillness is not apathy, it is vibrational stability. It is born from the recognition that the field responds to your state, not to your narrative about it. And something curious happens when this stability takes root. The circumstances that once seemed unbearable begin to dissolve without your needing to fight. People drift away, doors open, opportunities arise, synchronicities intensify. The quantum field, sensitive to coherence, responds precisely to the new frequency you sustain. It is like changing the radio station. The music does not need to be forced. It simply appears when you tune in correctly. This is true liberation, realizing that you were never imprisoned by situations, but by the vibration that sustained them. While your energy resonated with fear, the field showed you scenarios that confirmed fear. When you began to vibrate clarity, the field responded with clarity. It is simple, but not easy, because it requires continuous presence. Vibration is dynamic. It oscillates with what you think, feel, and believe. Therefore, changing vibration is not an event. It is a practice, a way of living. Many people believe that raising vibration means suppressing dense emotions, but that would be just another form of resistance. Vibration rises when you allow everything in you to be seen with honesty. There is no higher energy than truth. When you acknowledge an emotion without judgment, it naturally transforms. Consciousness is the transmuting element of the field. What is brought to the light of presence reorganizes itself. What is denied repeats itself. At some point, this quiet practice begins to alter your perception of time. The future ceases to be a distant promise and becomes a natural consequence of the current vibration. Anxiety loses strength because the focus is no longer on what will happen and shifts to how am I vibrating now. At each instant, you understand that you are sending a command to the field and that each gesture, word, and emotion are small energetic instructions about what you wish to experience. Life becomes a conscious dialogue between emitter and mirror. This awareness brings lightness. Things continue to happen, but without the charge of drama. What once seemed like a problem comes to be seen as an adjustment. Loss becomes redirection. Conflict becomes revelation. Delay becomes protection. Nothing is wasted, because everything reflects the vibrational state that asks for refinement. The world is no longer against you. It is collaborating with your expansion. And perceiving this is the essence of freedom. Changing vibration instead of circumstance is the most quiet and most revolutionary gesture a being can make. It is the point at which you become master of your own field. There is no arrogance in this, only responsibility. The energy you sustain is the foundation of all the realities you will inhabit. With each vibrational choice, a line of future is drawn. And when that choice is made in coherence, the entire universe organizes around it, as if it had always known the path you now remember to walk. To free yourself, after all, is not to escape the world, but to stop being a prisoner of the frequency that created it in misalignment. It is to remain in the same place and yet see everything in a new light. Because when vibration changes, the world changes, even if, to outside eyes, nothing has moved. The true revolution is invisible. It happens inside, in the instant when the being chooses to resonate with truth instead of fear. There comes a moment on the journey of consciousness when the search ceases. Not because the questions have been answered, but because something awakens in a place deeper than thought. It is as if an ancient memory, older than memory itself, begins to emerge. A soft, yet undeniable feeling that you have always had within you, what you spent your life trying to find outside. This is the reunion with inner power. Not a power that dominates, but the power that sustains, that creates, that observes, and knows. For a long time, this power remained dormant beneath layers of fear, guilt, and conditioning. From an early age, you were taught to believe that strength lies in achieving, competing, proving worth. You learned to seek approval and to measure your own light by the reaction of others. The world convinced you that power means influence, control, advantage. But the kind of power the quantum field speaks of is of another nature. It doesn't shout, it doesn't compete, it doesn't impose, it simply is. It is pure consciousness that knows it doesn't need to fight for space, because space itself organizes around its presence. When that memory awakens, everything changes in quality. The same body, the same routine, the same people, yet something in the way you exist in the world transforms. You stop asking for permission to exist. You stop begging for recognition. You stop seeking external signs to validate what you feel. The attention once directed outward begins to withdraw inward. And in that inward turning, you discover an inexhaustible source of silent energy. Inner power doesn't come from accumulation. It comes from alignment. The more you align with what is true, the more the field responds with flow. The reunion with this power is not a sudden event, but a gradual process. It begins with small perceptions, an intuition that proves right, a coincidence that repeats, a feeling that time adjusts itself to ease your path. Little by little, the mind gives way to trust. And then something arises that is not arrogance, but presence. A stillness that doesn't depend on circumstances. A vibrational center that remains unshaken, even when the world changes form. Inner power is the expression of consciousness when it remembers its own creative nature. It doesn't manifest through words of strength, but through coherence. There is a vibration that accompanies an aligned being, a field of clarity that transforms the environment. People feel different near someone who vibrates in this way, not because that person does something special, but because they radiate stability. It is presence that reorganizes the field around itself simply by existing in a state of harmony. On a quantum level, inner power is the ability to maintain frequency despite external variables. It is mastery of one's own vibrational emission. When you recognize this ability, the world stops seeming unpredictable, not because circumstances become stable, but because you become the fixed point amid movement. It is like the center of a whirlwind. Everything spins around, but the center remains silent. It is in that silence that true power resides. There is something profoundly liberating in realizing that power is not something to be conquered, but something to be remembered. Forgetfulness was the only veil, and awakening is simply the removal of that veil. Each time you remember who you are, a layer of fear dissolves, and what remains is vibrational purity, the clarity that everything that happens is a response to your own vibration. In that state, life ceases to be reaction and becomes conscious creation. The reunion with inner power also changes the relationship with time. The future stops being a projection of insecurity and becomes a field of malleable possibilities. The mind, once hurried, slows down. A serene confidence arises, as if the universe were conspiring, but in a quiet, intelligent way that doesn't need to be understood, only felt. You begin to act not out of fear of what might be missing, but out of joy for what already exists. And that vibration is magnetic. Living in this state, power becomes service. Because upon realizing yourself as a creator, you understand that everything you do resonates in the collective field. Each conscious choice is a wave of coherence that propagates. Each act of presence is a silent reminder to others that they too can awaken. Inner power is contagious, not through force, but through vibration. It awakens what is dormant around it. And this is where one understands the true reason why the quantum field responds to consciousness. The universe is a network of vibrational communication, and each awakened being amplifies the clarity of that network. When you awaken to your own power, you not only change your reality, you alter the reality around you. The entire field recalibrates to your frequency. Your peace becomes the environment. Your coherence becomes the path. Your vibration becomes the beacon. This reunion, more than a conquest, is a return. It is the remembrance that you never lost your power. You merely believed it was outside. And now, as you look within and recognize the spark that has always pulsed there, everything that once seemed effort becomes flow. The power that slept awakens, not to dominate the world, but to illuminate the experience of being in it. And in that instant, you understand. True strength is the consciousness that remains in love, even when the entire field is still learning to remember the same. Reality is not a fixed stage, but a living field that responds to the consciousness that inhabits it. Everything you experience is a dialogue between what you feel and what the universe returns. When the mind quiets and vibration aligns, the world reorganizes. The meaning that seemed lost reveals itself in the silence of presence. Nothing was out of place. It was only waiting for you to remember who you are. The power that creates reality has always been within, observing, choosing, vibrating. If you made it this far, write in the comments, "I awakened to the field," so I know you stayed until the end. And if this content resonated with you, subscribe to continue this journey of consciousness and creation.